morning. And today we begin a new study in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes has 12 chapters, but we have 13 weeks in this quarter. And so today's study will focus on an introduction to the book. And then we will begin next week examining chapter by chapter of the message of Ecclesiastes. It is a fascinating read. As you look at the book, if you're a pessimist, you will find that much of what it says you will be in full agreement with. But I would urge you to remember that the pessimistic outlook that is expressed through most of the text is ultimately refuted in chapter 12. The pessimism that fills the text is the direct result of a life lived apart from God and the will of God. And when you factor God into the equation, everything changes dramatically for the better. But it takes about 11 chapters to get there. And so I want you to keep the focus on the understanding that the text was written to ultimately conclude that life apart from God is meaningless. Life with God is filled with meaning. So keep that thought in mind as we go through the text for the next 13 weeks. Chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. I don't intend to read any more of the chapter than that today, but what I do want to do is acquaint you with the author and the substance of what he has to say. So let's begin with the title. In Hebrew, as Hebrew books generally are titled, we use the first word or phrase as the title for the text. And so in Hebrew, this book is called Koheleth. The word means teacher, preacher, or convener. It's only used, by the way, in Ecclesiastes that I'm aware of. There is a derivative that you are familiar with that translates to a degree this word from Hebrew to Greek, and it's the word ekklesia. Ek is a preposition meaning out or out of, and kaleo means to call. And of course, you're familiar with the term because it is often translated in the New Testament church. It is probably many times more accurately translated assembly. And so what we have in this particular title is a reference to one who either preaches, teaches, or convenes an assembly to speak to it. In the Greek, it is called Ecclesiastes, and in Latin, the equivalent. And thus we are familiar with the terminology as it appears first in the Septuagint and then into English translations. I don't think there are any Latin scholars among us. If I'm mistaken about that, you raise your hand and you can give us some background into the Latin title. I'm not a Latin scholar, and I'm not even an English scholar, but I do know that this particular book is written from the vantage point of one who has a message to share and is essentially saying, come hear it. Listen to what is to be said. Now, who possibly could have written Ecclesiastes? You will not find any identification in any of the 12 chapters relative to authorship. What you do have is some general description which leads us to conclude that it probably was written by Solomon. We know that Solomon was a prolific writer, specifically of Proverbs. We're familiar with the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, also called Canticle of Canticles. In everything else that is attributed to Solomon, his name appears somewhere in the title or in the particular work. The this is the exception to that. And there may be obvious reasons for it that we're not aware of. But what we do know is that the author identifies himself first and foremost as a son of David. David had several sons, among the most famous, Absalom. Absalom led the revolt against David, ultimately dying at the hands of Joab and his men because he was riding on a donkey through the woods when he got his head caught in a tree. The donkey continued on, and he's left hanging there. He's discovered, and although David had demanded that the young man live, Joab knew that if that happened, that he would continue to be a thorn in his father's side, and so Joab had him killed. And when David learned of it, he said, "Absalom, my son, Absalom, Absalom, my son, Absalom, would God I had died for thee." And he's just overwrought with emotion, and Joab says, "These people have risked their lives for you, and this is your response." And so David kind of got his act together and dealt with Absalom's death and continued to reign. So clearly Absalom couldn't have been the author here. Adonijah was probably the one that most would think of in terms of who would succeed his father to the throne, because Adonijah was the eldest of the boys and in all probability would have come to the throne and succeeded David, but that was not God's plan, and David in turn selected the son of Bathsheba, Solomon, to be his successor rather than Adonijah. And ultimately, because Adonijah schemed to undermine the credibility and authority of Solomon, he was eventually killed and taken out of the picture. And the only son of David to actually reign as king was the son of David and Bathsheba, Solomon. So if he calls himself a son of David, and we learn as well that he had great wisdom, and you can't be a Bible student and not associate Solomon and wisdom, you obviously are going to conclude that this author, as a son of David, as one of great wisdom, who, as you look at the text in chapter 2, 4 through 11, accomplished tremendous things, especially in terms of his vision for Jerusalem and for the country, and the kind of architecture that he was responsible for bringing about. You again think of Solomon and no one else. So from my perspective, I have no difficulty at all acknowledging Solomon as the author of Ecclesiastes. And generally, that was the consensus through the first several hundred years of the history of the church. Only recently, by recently within the last couple of hundred years, have critics arisen who have said that this is not a work of Solomon. It was not done in the days of Solomon, which would mean it was written approximately 3,000 years ago. They argued that it was probably written after the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, somewhere, they say, around maybe 200 BC, give or take a few years. Not a single argument they make to justify that notion is really supportable. They've all been refuted. And yet right now the consensus of especially liberal scholarship is that Solomon didn't write it. If we really needed to know, I suspect it would be stated very plainly in the text, just as I indicated Wednesday night would be the case in reference to Hebrews. But at the same time, the identification that the author does give leads us to conclude that only Solomon, to our knowledge, fits the bill. Now, the objections to this are as follows. His name does not occur in the book. Well, that's not so unusual, is it, when you already identify yourself as the son of David, as a man of great wisdom who's responsible for tremendous building projects? And the reality is that anyone knows the history of Israel would immediately associate all of that with only Solomon. All of Solomon's other writings, as I said, have his name somewhere in the title or somewhere in the text itself. This one doesn't, but again, that doesn't say he didn't write it. And I know you're sitting there wondering, what does all this really have to do with anything? Well, I think it's important to the best of our ability to get a really good idea based on the information available of who wrote it, which will tell us when it was written and give us some background as to how the ultimate conclusion found in chapter 12 was reached. And if Solomon is indeed the author, everything that he describes as having been accomplished certainly fits his context of his role as king, and during his reign, Israel reached its zenith of power and authority. His fame was known throughout the world of his day, and nearly everyone who knows anything knows about the record of Queen Sheba, the Queen of Sheba visiting, and she had heard so much about this great king over Israel, but when she came calling, as she left, she said the half had not been told. It was far greater than she had even been led to believe. That seems to be the picture that's being described here of one who has set his heart to all kinds of goals, realized each goal in succession, and yet concluded, when I was finished, it didn't add a thing to my life. Life was still vain. It was like chasing after the wind. And in fact, in chapter 1, he gives 3 or 4 illustrations of what life is like when you set a goal, work toward that goal, realize it, and then come to know that you're still the same person. You're not any happier. You're not any more secure. You're not more contented. In fact, you're generally less contented. What's wrong? And the ultimate conclusion is that these things can't fill the void, the spiritual void in every life. Only God can fill that void. And until God comes into your life, it's going to be vain, no matter what you achieve, what you know, what you accomplish. It's argued that apparent references to Solomon, what we've just cited in terms of being the son of David and being a man of great wisdom and also one who accomplished tremendous public works, is just used in an ideal sense. This happens a lot with modern scholarship. It looks at Scripture and responds, but this can't possibly be accurate. These things were not written when we think they were written from a conservative standpoint. The authors are simply using well-known names to give their message greater credibility. Well, I believe that that happens today. It happens all the time. Most of you are familiar with people who write books, well-known figures, and they sell millions of copies. What you don't probably know is that very few of them actually do the writing. Ghost writers put the book together. The author, whose name will be attached to the book, will review it, maybe make some suggestions, offer some comments, other kinds of things along that line, and then it goes to print under his or her name, which is highly recognizable, and they sell hundreds of thousands of copies and make bunches of money. That's very common today. But with Scripture, we're dealing with something else. This is inspired literature. God doesn't need to use those kinds of means to accomplish his purpose. If the author is represented as a son of David, it is because he was a son of David. It's not some idealistic concept that will give the message greater credence. God doesn't work that way. It's deceptive to argue that the book was written by a son of David, but not really. It's just somebody who's claiming to be a son of David to give his message greater credibility. In the world, I understand it. I get it. But in the Word, that's not how it works. God does not misrepresent. He does not mislead. He does not assign false identities. If we are ever going to have any understanding of authorship, we have to stick with the text, and when we do that, we're left with only one conclusion, that it clearly is a reference to King Solomon and all of the objections that have been raised. And I thought about sharing those with you and then decided, what's the point? They've all been addressed and refuted. There is no reason for us to question what the text says about the author, who is a son of David, king over Israel, and noted for his tremendous wisdom and for his public works. And there's only one king who fits that description, and that's King Solomon. Now, in Ecclesiastes, there are a number of themes that are addressed. There are many references to fear. Fear not as we generally associate it, however. Fear in terms of profound respect or reverence. And the ultimate conclusion everybody knows, if they're Bible students, is that man's whole, or the English translation is whole duty, is to fear God. That is to have a profound respect for Him. And that respect, in turn, will lead to obedience, our keeping His commandments. Interestingly, if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and read carefully what Moses, as God's spokesman, says to God's people Israel prior to the conquest, he begins and essentially ends with the idea that God is to be feared, to be reverenced and respected, and that will lead to our love for Him, our desire to know Him by knowing His Word and will, our willingness to share that message with others, and a commitment to serve Him exclusively, diligently, and perpetually, concluding again with the idea of having profound respect for Him. That's all in Deuteronomy chapter 6, and I know that we've covered that text on more than one occasion and may return to it again at some point. Another is time, and if, again, you're a student of the Bible and you see the word time, you can't help but think of chapter 3. And the message there is there's pretty much a time for everything in life. Time to be born and a time to die. Even a time to kill. You may wonder, when could that be appropriate? But if you're a Bible student, you may be surprised, then again you may not be surprised to learn that some of God's greatest servants were also great warriors. David, the father of Solomon, immediately comes to mind. How did he secure his wife, Michal, the daughter of Saul? He paid a dowry. He had offered 100 changes of garments. He actually provided 200. Do you know where he got them? From slaying 200 Philistines and taking their clothing. It was said of David and Saul had slain his thousands. David had slain his 10,000s. It so angered King Saul that he sought numerous times to kill David. And yet David, throughout his life, continued to honor and obey Saul. On one occasion, when Saul went into a cave to relieve himself, David and his men were hidden further back in the cave. David's men urged David to kill Saul, and David refused. He cut off a portion of his cloak, and Saul never knew until he had gotten out and gone back to camp, and David told him what had happened. And his response was essentially, for every opportunity he had to eliminate his enemy, King Saul, David refused, because he said, God put him on the throne. God will take him off. That is not my place. But he was a man of tremendous skill on the battlefield. There's a time to kill. Do you think that's what David or Solomon rather had in mind there? There are many other things we'll address in chapter 3 and elsewhere, but it is a major theme. Seeing is a major theme in Ecclesiastes. Do you ever see things but don't see them? One of the things that Solomon, if indeed he is the author, advocates is that we see things but we really don't see them. We see them but we don't understand them. It's important to be able to see and understand or comprehend what we have seen. And what we see often is very deceptive. And with wisdom we may learn to see better. There's also knowing as an important theme. You know and you think you know. Often what we think we know turns out not to be true. It happens over and over again in life. There are so many examples of it. I don't want to get political, so I use this illustration without any intended political overtones. For 4 years, we were led to believe that President Trump was in league with Putin and the Russians in the so-called conspiracy to steal the election. That has all been fully debunked. There is no one with any real knowledge who believes that the so-called Steele dossier had any truth attached to it. But for 4 years, it was held up as the truth, and everybody thought they knew when they didn't know at all. And that's just one example. I hate to use a political one, but it's a perfect example of how people think they know something when they really don't know at all. And right now, and again, I'm not trying to be political, but the so-called January 6th insurrection, it's the only insurrection I've ever heard of when not a single insurrectionist had a weapon. And the only person to die by violence was a woman who was shot, and to this very day there has never been an explanation for why. Yes, it is argued that several of the Capitol Guards, I think 3 or 4, died. When the truth came out, one that was held up as having lost his life actually died of a stroke. Another person who died had a heart attack, and another, I believe, was a drug overdose. But you don't hear that. You think you know when you really don't. And then when the truth eventually gets out, it's buried someplace on page 16 where nobody ever reads it, and you just think you know what you don't know. And it happens religiously as well. And it happens all the time. And Solomon says there's a difference between knowing, truly knowing and understanding, and just thinking you know. He talks about eating and drinking. What's life about? Well, some would say it's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. And that's becoming even more popular in our own day. Some of the things that are occurring throughout our nation are happening because people think that life has no meaning, no real value. You say, well, how can you say that? Because right now, the Supreme Court is debating the validity of Roe versus Wade in terms of a couple of state laws that have decided that abortion after the 15th week is unacceptable. And you've got people out there proclaiming their pride in their right to kill unborn babies, mothers who are wanting that termination to occur right up until the 9th month. It's indefensible. But for those folks, it doesn't matter that a child is being murdered. All that matters is what is convenient and best for them personally. And if a child is inconvenient, just dispose of it. a lot of folks just want to ignore it. Well, it doesn't concern me. Well, it does, because it's indicative of a society that thinks only of itself. Selfishness pervades our culture. Eating, drinking, and being merry are all that matters to a lot of folks. And so we have alcohol addiction, drug addiction, sexual addiction, and any other kind of addiction you want to add to the list. And then when people who have no knowledge, no understanding, no background in God and God's Word do crazy things, we just want to blame it on mental illness. When the fact of the matter is, people are just evil and sinful, and there's no defense. This is what happens when all we think about is ourselves. But Solomon said, I had everything to eat that my heart desired, and everything to drink that I wanted, and I experienced all kinds of pleasure, and my life was still empty. It will always be empty when you live for yourself. He talks about profit and justice and what's good and right, and how so often society confuses the two. And he contrasts foolishness and wisdom, good and evil, and joy and trouble. And all of those things are addressed in these 12 chapters. And if you read and do not understand his purpose, you walk away, I believe, really depressed. But if you read from the perspective of the author, who has experienced all these things, and now he's old and he's looking back and he's making the observation, it's an inspired one, none of these things satisfy. They didn't in his life, they won't in our lives. What satisfies the true inner longings of the human heart is a relationship with the Creator. And without that relationship, life will never hold the meaning, purpose, and joy that the Creator intended. That's the message of Ecclesiastes. There are some specific phrases that you'll encounter as you read the book. He talks about that which is under the sun. What he's describing is those conditions that are true and observable upon this earth. But this is not the only realm. Ours is the physical and material realm. There is also a spiritual and eternal realm. And what may be true of under the sun is not true outside of that material and physical realm. So when you encounter the phrase under the sun, please note that the observations are made in connection to life on this earth, where we live under the sun. Vanity of vanities, or meaningless, saith the preacher, the Koheleth, the speaker or teacher. I had everything the world has to offer, and what did I discover? Meaningless, futile. In fact, the New American Standard Bible uses futility frequently in relationship to these issues. Vanity is the Hebrew word hebel. And what you may not know is that this word is used in Genesis 4 as a proper name for Abel, the second son of Adam and Eve. The significance of that, I'm not sure, but you can be aware of it. 38 times in Ecclesiastes we encounter this word. Striving, chasing after the wind, or vexation of spirit, I believe the King James uses, expresses the proper attitude of life lived without God, where we focus on what we're able to accomplish or build, what we're able to enjoy with our senses, eating and drinking, what we're able to accumulate in terms of gold, silver, precious jewels, what we're able to achieve in terms of intellectual knowledge and the wisdom that often comes with it. He says all of that is really without value when you leave God out of life. Life is without God like chasing the wind. Do you ever catch the wind? The answer is no, you don't. It's a continual cycle of failure. Life lived without God is like that. And again, next week when we get to chapter 1, God willing, there are several examples that illustrate why this is true, why it's a striving after wind or vexation of spirit. And the reason that either translation is acceptable is that spirit in Hebrew essentially means breath. I see that wasp there, Southern Belle. You kill it, I'll give you another $1. I paid a bounty Wednesday night. You get that one, I'll give you another $1. Chasing after the wind, vexation of spirit. The word wind is also the word for breath or spirit. And the point is, and I think obviously chasing after the wind is a far preferable translation to vexation of the spirit, is that no matter what you achieve in life, it is worthless and meaningless when God is left out of the process. And when you look at life today, what are you seeing if you're really observant? More and more people abandoning faith, living life without God, and facing all of what the devil has to throw at them without any faith, any hope, without seeing any value in this world or in this life. Solomon identified 21 areas of vanity in the text. All the works of men, verse 14. Not going to read the text because we'll be doing that as the class unfolds for the next quarter. But he says everything we build is vanity. Why is that? Because it doesn't last. It will eventually dissolve. And not only will it dissolve, the building will be lost, but the builder will be forgotten. There is no real achievement in building that is lasting. Indulgence in pleasure is, according to the text, vain, futile. Because pleasure is short-lived. Now, when I say that as Bible students, whom do you immediately think of? And the answer should be Moses, of whom it is said in Hebrews 11, he chose rather to endure affliction with the children of Israel than to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season. And I think it's really important to highlight the idea that sin is pleasurable. Don't deny it, because it's true. If it weren't pleasurable, it wouldn't have any appeal. But the reality is that the pleasure derived from sin is short-lived. It doesn't last. And Moses realized that that was the case, and he thought it's better to endure affliction, to suffer with my people, than to reject them and thus to reject God's will for my life and have a relatively easy life here and then be lost eternally. He didn't think that was a fair trade-off. He would rather forfeit the momentary pleasures of life as the son of Pharaoh's daughter and face the affliction that would come upon him as a child of Abraham, knowing that whatever pleasure he would have enjoyed wouldn't last, but the benefits and blessings of suffering for the sake of God and a relationship with the Creator are eternal. And when you put things in that perspective, the trade-off is certainly not worth it, and Solomon points that out. He talks about the profit of one's labor as being vain or futile. Because no matter how hard you work, how successful you are, guess what happens? You're going to die. And how much of that stuff that you have achieved or collected or have earned are you going to take with you when you die? And the answer clearly is nothing. And what's going to happen to it? It's going to go to someone else. And you don't have a clue whether they will value it and use it or abuse it and throw it away. That's vain. It's futile. Why do people work so hard to accumulate and hold on to what they cannot possibly keep? I think it was Jim Elliot, a missionary to the Ecuador, the Aucas, I believe were the natives of Ecuador, who died at a very young age trying to teach them the gospel. And when he left, he said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep in order to have what he cannot lose." I thought that's a good summation of what Solomon is saying in Ecclesiastes, in his contrast between what people think matters and what really matters. The things that people think are important aren't. They're often futile and vain. Talks about the quest for wisdom, the desire to know more and more and understand more and more. But that desire is never satisfied for two reasons. There's always more to learn, and because of our humanity, we often forget what we've already learned. I'm constantly having to relearn things because I will forget, and I have to go back and work again to recapture what I thought I had. And I'm saying that relative primarily to biblical knowledge. It's not possible, at least it's not possible for me to learn something and know I will always have it from there out. When our children were young, I tried to teach them not only all the books of the Bible, but the genealogy of Jesus, the sons of Jacob, the kings of Israel and Judah, all the judges, and they did a really good job. I don't know if they still can do it or not. I do know that I have to go back and refresh my own memory. That's pretty normal for humans. So no matter how diligent we are in our quest for wisdom, it's a never-ending struggle. He says it's vain or futile. The focus on earthly accomplishments, because they are ultimately forgotten. 100 years from now, will anyone, if the world stands, even know we existed outside of a very limited scope, unless we do something usually infamous? Even the famous have their 15 minutes of fame and are forgotten. Why is it so important then? Achievement but done while ignoring God is vain. Should we seek to accomplish things? Yes. But always factor God into the equation. That's the point that he's making. An overemphasis on life and living is vain as well. You see, ultimately, the Bible does not place emphasis on longevity, how long we live. The Bible's emphasis is on how we live. It is quality over quantity. But that is not the world's view. Competition, according to Solomon, is vain, chapter 4, verse 4. Hoarding riches is vain, verses 7 and 8. And again, it's because when you're done and life is over and it ends for all of us, just like the animals, so it is true with us. We return to the dust. What in the world is all of that stuff you've accumulated really going to matter? I guess we have 12 more that I need to get through in a hurry. Talks about trying to please everyone, the foolishness of The use of words and promises, emptiness. If you're going to promise someone something, do it. Promises are worthless if they're not backed up. One of the things you learn about God is that He always keeps His promises. He doesn't forget them. He honors them. God's people should do the same. Having much money is vanity. With more money comes more worry, more responsibility, greater heartaches. The irresponsible use of wealth is vain, futile, 6:2-11. Greedy ambition is futile, 6:9. The use of many words masterfully utilized. It's interesting to me, Paul said to the church at Corinth, I didn't come with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and power. God's word does not require an orator to communicate it. That's true of really all communication. When it is done well, it is done with brevity and clarity, and 10-cylinder words are not required. Association with foolish friends is futile. Trying to understand the anomalies of life is futile. They're just things that we're not going to understand. If you spend all of your time trying to figure out what you're not capable of comprehending because God has not revealed it, you have spent your life futilely. Indifference toward evil is described as vanity or futility. The system of justice and retribution that is observable is often futile because justice is not always achieved. One of the warnings that you find throughout the law of Moses is against judges who take bribes and how they will favor the rich over the poor, or sometimes the poor over the rich without any real regard for right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust. Looking to the days ahead for meaning and happiness. You know that's futile, in particular from our recent study of James 4:13-17, if not elsewhere. Death itself is described as vanity or futility. This list of 21 is taken from the Truth for Today commentaries that are available in our library. They're still being written as I speak. A number of volumes are yet to be completed, but we have all that are available thus far. And if you're wanting a good commentary on any book of the Bible, old or new, and those are available, I'd urge you to utilize them. They are excellent commentaries on Scripture. Next week, God willing, we will start in chapter 1, and we will read the text. I have a series of questions that we will be examining at the close of each chapter. So you come next week, hopefully having already read chapter 1 a few times, and ask yourself as you read, what is the purpose that our author is seeking to accomplish, and how does he go about it? What illustrations does he use to get his meaning across? And we'll try to get through this book, and in 12 weeks now, be able to honestly say, I get what Solomon was talking about. And I understand that until I understand his message, my life will never hold the meaning and purpose, and I'll never experience the joy and happiness that God intends for his creation. So next week, we begin in chapter 1, verse 1.